Hello and welcome back. I am Jonathan and this is my second Old Testament themed vlog. As you already know, I chose the theme of love in the Old Testament. The first video focused on God's love in the Old Testament, while this video is going to focus on the theme of how we are called to love. Like the last video, I'm going to start this one off with a bit of scripture from the New Testament before we jump into discovering what the Old Testament has to say about how we should love. In the last video, we discussed how 1 John 4:8 establishes that God is love. In this video, I want to explore a little more of what the New Testament has to say. Almost everyone knows John 3:16. But what about 1 John 3:16? Where we are told that we know love by the sacrifice that Christ has made for us and encouraging us to be willing to lay down our own lives for our brothers and sisters if necessary. 1 Corinthians 13:8 tells us that all gifts of the Spirit are worthless without the love of God in our hearts. And Hebrews 9:11 establishes Christ as a new high priest and declares that we, the people of God, are the new and more perfect tabernacle. In other words, we are the house of God. We are his temple. He lives in us. Now, if we know that God is love and that he lives within us, shouldn't that love be on display in our lives? Let's see what the Old Testament has to say about that love in our lives. In last week's audio presentation, I talked about the Ten Commandments and how they were instructions for how to live in relationship with God and each other. Whether in Exodus or Deuteronomy, clues on how to live can certainly be found in these commandments from God. I'll try to be brief in my discussion of Deuteronomy 5:7-21 and pull from other areas of the Old Testament. But the Ten Commandments are important enough to the topic that I can't just skip over them altogether. In verses 7-15, we see God establishing how to love or live in relationship to him. We do this by placing no God before him, having no idols, not taking his name in vain, and honoring the Sabbath. By honoring the Sabbath, we set apart a time that is holy and special to honor God. In relation to the creation cosmology of God having rested on the seventh day, we are reminded of the sovereignty of God the Creator. Also, we are instructed to remember that God's children were slaves in Egypt and that God loved them enough to free them. In verses 16-21, we see God telling us how to love or live in relationship to one another. We see the importance of family established as well as honoring authority within that family. We see that life has value and that we should not take it. We see that physical intimacy has value and that relationship or covenant has value and should be respected. We are taught to place value on the property of others and to respect that property. Finally, we are taught that doing the right thing isn't enough, that the desires of our hearts matter. To truly live in love, we must have no evil desire or jealousy in our hearts. There are many other places in the Old Testament to talk about loving God. Joshua 23:11 warns us or cautions us to always love God. Deuteronomy 30:6 explains that God will circumcise the hearts of his children so that they will always love him with all of their hearts and soul. Deuteronomy 10:12 also tells us to love God and to serve him with all of our heart and soul. But it also instructs us to walk in all his ways. This tells us that obedience to God is seen as an expression of our love for him. Now, we covered some verses that instruct us on loving God. But let us take a look at some other Old Testament verses about loving each other. Zechariah 8:17 instructs us not to plot evil on others, while Deuteronomy 10:18 says that God feeds and clothes foreigners or strangers, while verse 19 instructs us to do the same. The verse then reminds us that God's children were once foreigners or strangers in Egypt. Leviticus 19:34 also instructs us on how we should treat strangers or foreigners. The verse tells us to love them as we do ourselves and calls us to treat them as though they weren't strangers or foreigners at all. Micah 7:18 tells us that the Lord delights in steadfast love. Therefore, the better we love one another, the more he delights. Leviticus 19:17 tells us not to hate and to reason honestly and directly with one another. Proverbs 3 and 4 tells us that steadfast love and faithfulness should always be upon our hearts, while Proverbs 10:12 tells us that hatred causes problems, while love covers or protects against offense. Proverbs 17:17 tells us that a friend loves at all times. In the story of Ruth, we see Ruth expressing love to her mother-in-law with faithful sacrifice and commitment. This commitment and sacrifice are an example of our capacity to express steadfast love to one another. Ecclesiastes 4:9-12 speaks about the rewards and benefits of two people working together and helping one another out. In summary, the Old Testament of the Bible tells us how to love God and each other. It is a theme woven through the pages of its books like a thread in a beautiful tapestry. We are taught to love God by putting him first, obeying him, and by setting time apart for him. We are taught to love one another by communicating honestly and directly with one another, helping each other with tasks, being faithful to one another, feeding and clothing one another, respecting the relationships and property of one another, and keeping a pure heart towards one another. What an awesome God we serve. We serve a God full of love and compassion. I'm thankful for that, and I'm thankful that he had the good sense to leave me instructions on how to love him and others. In their own right, loving God and loving others are the two great commands that Christ declares all of the laws hang upon. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this Old Testament theme video. I know that love is certainly my favorite theme in the Old and New Testaments. Thank you, and God bless.